Jesse James was raised in a Missouri farm, and their family shared sympathy for the Southern cause when the American Civil War began. His brother Frank joined Quantrill's Confederate guerrillas and became friends with Cole Younger. Jesse joined Bloody Bill Anderson's guerrilla gang. After the war ended, Jesse reportedly was shot and severely wounded by Federal soldiers while under the flag of truce. In 1866, Jesse and Frank, along with 8 other men, started their outlaw career by robbing a bank in Liberty, Missouri. That same year, Cole Younger joined the gang, and his brothers followed in the next few years. The James gang robbed banks across Iowa, Alabama, Texas, and began holding up trains in 1873. They also targeted stagecoaches, stores, and individuals. Their exploits were often exaggerated and romanticized by writers to cater to Eastern readers who had an appetite for thrilling Western tales just like we do now. Jesse became a romantic figure amongst the Missouri Ozark people, who saw him as driven to a life of crime by authorities who never forgave his Southern allegiance. Jesse and Frank often justified their crimes as persecution. On September 7th of 1876, the James gang nearly met its end while trying to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota called the First National Bank. Only the James brothers escaped. In 1879, they formed a new gang and resumed robbing. In 1881, Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden offered a $10,000 reward for their capture. Crittenden allegedly promised immunity for Robert Ford, whose brother Charlie was in the gang, if he killed Jesse. Jesse, living under the pseudonym Thomas Howard, was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford while he was adjusting a picture frame in his house. It's kind of famous. There's pictures and artwork of it as well. Robert Ford was later portrayed as a traitor, especially in the folk song The Ballad of Jesse James. Ford was eventually shot in Creede, Colorado in 1892 by Edward Capehart O'Kelly, who was seen by some as Jesse's avenger. O'Kelly's life sentence was commuted in 1901 by Colorado Governor James Bradley Orman after pleas for clemency. A few months after Jesse's death, Frank surrendered, his brother, and he was tried for murder and robbery but was acquitted each time. Frank then retired to his family farm where he lived a quiet life until his death in 1915 in the same room he was born. Billy the Kid. We all know Billy the Kid if you watch this channel. We haven't even covered him yet, but I'm going to assume everybody that watches a YouTube channel on the Wild West has heard and knows the story of Billy the Kid. But his death is controversial and very famous, so we're going to cover it on this one. So Billy the Kid was born November 23rd of 1859, possibly somewhere around there, in New York, New York, and is obviously one of the most notorious outlaws and gunfighters of the American West. Despite his claim of 21 men killed, we think that the number's fewer than 10. So he was born on New York's East Side, and his birth name, we think, is Henry McCarty or William H. Bonney Jr. He moved with his family to Kansas as a child. After his father died, his mother remarried, and the family relocated to Colorado, and then later to New Mexico. In his early teens, Billy turned to a life of crime, wandering the southwest and northern Mexico, often in the company of gangs. Billy's criminal activity escalated until he was captured by Sheriff Pat Garrett in December of 1880. He was tried for a murder in April of 1881 in Mesilla, New Mexico, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. However, on April 28th of 1881, Billy made a daring escape from jail, killing 2 deputies in the process, and he remained a fugitive until Pat Garrett tracked him down. On the evening of July 14th of 1881, at a ranch home of Pete Maxwell in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, Billy the Kid met his end. Garrett, having been tipped off about Billy's whereabouts, waited in Maxwell's darkened bedroom. When Billy entered, he was reportedly unarmed and asked in Spanish, "Who is this?" Garrett responds with 2 fatal shots, one hitting Billy in the chest, killing him instantly. The dramatic end of his life cemented Billy the Kid's status as arguably the most legendary figure of the Wild West. You can find Billy's grave in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and his life and death have inspired countless stories and legends. There remains some debate of his true identity. Like I said earlier, he's known as Henry McCarty during his childhood. He would later use the name William H. Bonney Jr. Another theory suggest that Billy the Kid was actually Ollie L. Roberts, or Brushy Bill, who purportedly escaped and lived in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest and performed Wild West shows until the 1950s. Butch Cassidy. Butch Cassidy was a notorious American outlaw and a leading member of the Wild Bunch, a gang of bank and train robbers who operated throughout the western United States in the 1880s and 90s. Robert Parker, who later took on the alias Butch Cassidy, adopted his new name from Mike Cassidy, an older outlaw who taught him cattle rustling and gunslinging between 1884 and 1887. Except for the 2 years spent working as a cowboy, from 91 to 92, and another 2 years in the Wyoming State Prison, 94 to 96, Butch Cassidy spent most of his life in the company of various outlaws. His closest friend and partner in crime was L.Z. Lay. Together, whether alone or part of the gang, they robbed numerous trains and banks and paymasters and rustled horses and cattle. In 1899, after L.Z. Lay was arrested and imprisoned, Cassidy teamed up with Harry Longbaugh, known as the Sundance Kid, which we're going to cover right after this, with law enforcement, including sheriff posses and Pinkerton detectives closing in on the members of the Wild Bunch. Cassidy and Sundance's girlfriend, Etta Place, fled to New York City and then to South America in 1901. From 1902 to 1906, they owned and operated a ranch in the Chubut province of Argentina. However, they eventually returned to their life of crime, robbing banks, trains, mine stations, while drifting from country to country. In 1909, Pinkerton agents reported that Cassidy and Sundance were trapped by mounted soldiers near San Vicente, Bolivia. And during the standoff, Sundance was reportedly mortally wounded, and Cassidy, not wanting to be captured, allegedly shot himself. However, other stories claim that they died in Mercedes, Uruguay in December of 1911, killed by soldiers during a bank robbery. There are numerous other legends suggesting that Cassidy, either alone or with Sundance, survived and returned to the United States, living in obscurity. Some say he drifted from Mexico to Alaska and died in 1937 in the Northwest or Nevada, possibly in Spokane, Washington. Now, there are varying accounts that contribute to the mystery of it. Before social media and the internet, a lot of legends were born from this. Probably was killed in South America, but there are still some accounts that him and Sundance survived. And we'll move right into his partner in crime, the Sundance Kid, even though we kind of touched on their end of life. So Harry Longbaugh, who later became known as the Sundance Kid, left home at the age of 15. He earned his nickname from the town of Sundance, Wyoming, where he was imprisoned from August of 1887 to February of 1889 for stealing a horse. After his release, he headed to the outlaw hideout known as Hole in the Wall in central Wyoming, marking the beginning of his criminal career. At the turn of the century, the Sundance Kid partnered with Butch Cassidy and Cassidy's girlfriend at a place. Again, we just talked about that. In 1901, the trio fled to New York City, then moved to South America, where they established their ranch. And same thing with Sundance as it was with Cassidy. They had a ranch. Then by 1906, they kind of got back in their old lifestyle of robbing banks and trains across Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru. And Sundance briefly escorted the ailing at a place back to the United States in 1907 before returning to South America to rejoin Cassidy. And then in 1909, according to Pinkerton detectives, Sundance and Butch Cassidy were cornered by Bolivian cavalry, and then they were both claimed to have been shot then. Same thing with Butch Cassidy on his end of life. There are some reports or legends that say that Sundance survived and then returned to the United States, living under the alias Harry Long. Some believe he died in obscurity somewhere in the West, perhaps in Casper, Wyoming, they think. The legends say in the 1930s, and some legends and accounts say as late as 1957, which we're not that far removed from. John Wesley Hardin. was the most notorious killer and quick-draw gunman of the Texas frontier, responsible for the deaths of at least 21 men in gun duels and ambushes between 1868 and 1877. Growing up during the turbulent Reconstruction period of the defeated South, Hardin developed a strong anti-black and anti-Yankee sentiment. At the age of 15 in 1868, he killed his first man who was an ex-slave. From that point on, Hardin's life was marked by gunslinging, dueling, gambling, and drinking. Over his career, he killed at least 8 Union soldiers and 4 black policemen who were pursuing him on various murder charges. Hardin's violent spree eventually led him to flee Texas, but he was captured in Pensacola and returned to Austin, Texas for trial in September of 1877. Convicted, he was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in the state prison in Huntsville. After serving 17 years, he was pardoned in 1894 and retired to Gonzales, Texas, where he lived a relatively peaceful life with his 3 children. His wife, who he married in 1872, died while he was in prison. Hardin remarried but soon abandoned his new wife and moved to El Paso, where he reverted to a life of dissipation and thievery. On August 19th of 1895, while standing at a bar at the Acme Saloon, Hardin was shot in the back of the head by John Selman Sr., an El Paso policeman and fellow thief who Hardin had a long-standing feud. Selman was subsequently tried for Hardin's murder, but was acquitted. Hardin's life and exploits were chronicled in his autobiography, The Life of John Wesley Hardin, as written by himself, published posthumously in 1896. So after he died, they published it. This self-advertised account cemented his legacy as one of the most infamous figures of the Texas frontier. Sam Bass. Sam Bass was an infamous American Western outlaw whose life ended in a dramatic showdown with the Texas Rangers. At the age of 18, Bass left his Indiana home and made his way to Texas, where he met Joel Collins in 1874. The two men became friends, and in 1876, they participated in a cattle drive up north. However, they soon turned to a life of crime, robbing stagecoaches. In September of 1877, along with 4 others, Bass and Collins robbed a Union Pacific train in Big Springs, Nebraska, making off with $65,000 in gold coins and other valuables. Returning to Texas, Bass formed a gang and continued his career as an outlaw, primarily focusing on train robberies. The Texas Rangers were hot on his trail, however, in July of 1878, a former associate named Jim Murphy betrayed Bass to the Rangers. As Bass attempted to rob a bank in Round Rock, Texas, the Rangers ambushed him. He was shot and seriously wounded. He died 2 days later on his 27th birthday. Sam Bass's career as an outlaw was pretty short compared to some of the others, but very impactful. His robbery of the Union Pacific train became one of the most famous crimes of the time, and his eventual death at the hands of the Texas Rangers only added to his legend. Let me introduce you to the bandit queen herself, Belle Starr. Belle Starr, the notorious outlaw, had a fascinating and tumultuous life filled with adventure and tragedy. Born as Myra Belle Shirley in a log cabin near Carthage, Missouri on February 5th of 1848, she grew up in a family with a colorful past. Her father, Judge John Shirley, was a bit of a rebel from a wealthy Virginia family who had moved west and married 3 times. Belle's mother, Elizabeth Pennington, hailed from the feuding Hatfields and McCoy family. In her early years, Belle enjoyed a privileged upbringing, attending the Carthage Female Academy. She was a bright student and excelled in music and classical languages. Despite her refined education, Belle also had a mischievous streak and showed love of her status as the rich girl. She embraced the outdoors, spending days exploring the countryside with her older brother Bud, who taught her how to ride horses and handle a gun. Belle's life took a dramatic turn when the Kansas-Missouri border war erupted. This war tore communities apart, forcing people to take sides and actually turning neighbors into enemies. Belle's brother Bud joined Quantrill's Raiders, a band of Confederate guerrillas. He actually served as a scout and achieved the rank of captain. But Bud was killed in June of 1864, and it was a devastating loss to the family, which led them to face financial hardships due to the raids that happened during the war, and Belle's father decided to sell their property in Missouri and move down to Texas. It was in Texas that Bell's path crossed with some of the most notorious outlaws of this time. The famous James Younger gang, which included Jesse and Frank James, arrived in Texas after robbing their first bank in Liberty, Missouri. Bell was immediately drawn to Cole Younger and became infatuated with him. Even with all this, she actually married another man named Jim Reed, who she had known back in Missouri. They settled in Texas, initially living with Bell's family before moving to Missouri, where they had 2 children. Although, rumors circulated that Bell had another relationship with Cole Younger and actually bore his child, even though there's not any evidence to support this case. Bell's marriage to Jim Reed was okay with her family. He wasn't a wanted man yet. But Reed's outlaw activity actually caught up with him, and he was killed in a gunfight in 1874, and that left Bell a widow with 2 young children, and she took to the outlaw trail. During her time as an outlaw, Bell became involved with several different outlaws, including Blue Duck and eventually Sam Starr, a Cherokee. Bell and Sam settled down on a farm in Oklahoma, which Bell's named Younger's Bend in honor of Cole Younger. They formed their own gang and engaged in rustling, horse stealing, and bootlegging whiskey to Native Americans. Bell's intelligence and careful planning earned her the reputation as the brains behind the operation. Bell's criminal activity did not go unnoticed, and she repeatedly found herself in conflict with the law. Judge Isaac Park, known as, quote, the hanging judge, it's pretty terrifying if you're an outlaw, was determined to bring Bell to justice. Although she was arrested multiple times, she often evaded conviction due to lack of evidence. Bell's life took another tragic turn when Sam Starr was killed in a gunfight. Soon after, Bell entered into her 3rd marriage with a much younger outlaw, a man named Jim July. Their relationship was stormy, and there were actually reports of domestic violence. It is believed that July even attempted to have Bell killed. Ultimately, Belle Starr met her end on February 3rd of 1889 when she was ambushed and shot to death on a country road at the age of 41. Her death sparked an investigation, and several suspects were questioned, including her husband Jim July, her son Ed, her daughter Pearl, and a neighbor named Watson. The circumstances surrounding Bell's death remain somewhat mysterious, with rumors of family discord, possibly incestuous relationships, and conflicts over marriage alliances. It's very shady, very mysterious. Bell was laid to rest in the front yard of her cabin at Younger's Bend. Her daughter Pearl later had a monument erected over her grave featuring an image of Bell's favorite horse, Venus. Pretty cool name. The inscription on the stone expresses a sentiment that Bell's spirit still shone bright despite the loss of her physical form. Belle Starr's life was filled with adventure, danger, and tragedy. She embraced the life of an outlaw, became an iconic figure of the Wild West, and left behind a legacy that still captivates the fans like us of the Wild West to this day. Jim Miller, also known as Killer Miller, was an outlaw born in Van Buren, Arkansas in 1861. His family moved to Texas when he was just 1 year old. Miller's life of crime began with the murder of his sister's husband, a man named John Coop, in 1880. Coop was found dead in his bed with a shotgun blast, and Miller was soon arrested since he was known to hate his brother-in-law. Although he was sentenced to life in prison, his attorneys took the case to the Texas Court of Appeals, and the conviction was overturned on a technicality. However, this encounter with the law did not deter Miller from a life of crime. He joined an outlaw gang in San Saba County, Texas, and began robbing trains and stagecoaches while committing murders. Miller even bought a saloon in San Saba and became an assassin, earning a reputation for completing jobs quickly and efficiently for a fee that varied between $150 and $2,000. He was notorious for assassinating his targets at night with a shotgun, and despite his work, Miller never drank, cursed, or smoked. Even though in the picture he's smoking a cigar, so I'm assuming he smoked cigars, maybe just not cigarettes. He was always well-dressed and regularly attended church, and that earned him the nickname Deacon Miller on top of his other nickname, Killer Miller. In 1893, Miller became the town marshal of Pecos, Texas, and earned a reputation for killing Mexicans, claiming that they were trying to escape. He then began a feud with the Pecos sheriff George Bud Frazier. Frazier contacted the Texas Rangers to intercept Miller's plans to shoot him when he returned to town, resulting in Miller's arrest to conspire to kill the sheriff. However, Miller managed to avoid conviction by having his henchmen track down and kill all of the witnesses. The feud between Frazier and Miller culminated in 1894 when Frazier encountered Miller on the street and opened fire, leaving him for dead. However, Killer Miller had been wearing a metal breastplate under his black frock, and he survived the encounter. Frazier eventually moved to New Mexico after losing his sheriff election. Despite his family's wealth through real estate, Miller continued to work as an assassin into the early 1900s. His assassination business rivals attorneys, lawmen, and anyone who received an assassination request. Despite being seen during these assassinations, Miller managed to stay out of jail either by claiming self-defense or just having all of the witnesses murdered before trial. That just blows my mind. Miller's luck ran out in 1909 when he was contracted by ranchers Jesse West and Joe Allen to assassinate cattle rancher and former deputy U.S. Marshal Gus Bobbitt in Ada, Oklahoma. Miller shot Bobbitt with a shotgun, his signature move, but a 19-year-old cowhand named Oscar Peeler witnessed the crime and turned the men in. The Texas Rangers tracked the men down and extradited them to Oklahoma to stand trial. However, Ada residents were aware of Miller's reputation for getting his convictions overturned and decided to take matters into their own hands. A lynch mob of 30 to 40 people broke into the jail and dragged Miller and his 3 accomplices to a stable behind the jail. Despite his accomplices' pleas, Miller remained stone cold and requested a diamond ring be given to his wife and wear his black hat during the hanging. His request was granted and he shouted, quote, "Let her rip," before voluntarily stepping off the box to hang. Miller's body was returned to Texas and he's buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Fort Worth.